Not making a start because we're on a very tight schedule. So if you can quietly find your chairs. Right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Our second plenary is titled Future Horizons for the Design and Specification of Office Buildings. The relative success of home working early in the pandemic led to many organisations declaring that their needs for the office were over. However, the experience of an extended period of absence from the workplace has shown the critical role played by the workplace in fostering a sense of community, belonging, culture, creative collaboration, and teamwork, with most organisations now actively planning for a future of hybrid working, combining the best of the physical and virtual worlds of work. So how can we create spaces with a physical digital information ecosystem that seamlessly bridges the experimental gap between employees working from home and those in the physical workplace? What standards and solutions do we need to develop for the new digital interfaces to support the in real life technologies needed to create the compelling experiences that attract people back to the workplace? A panel of subject matter experts drawn from the BCO Technical Committee sit before us, who over the last year have produced a series of first-line responses to the pandemic in the form of technical briefing notes. They will debate these questions together with the impact and other key challenges the industry is facing to meet the requirements of net zero agenda, carbon agenda, new regulation in the form of future building standards and post-Grenfell fire standards. I have great pleasure in introducing Neil Pinell from Landsec as your session chair to introduce his panel and set the scene. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you. Robin, I think you might have taken my notes.
I wondered when you'd remember.
Old tech, yeah. I've got a great panel to introduce to you, but just before I do that, obviously COVID-19's refocused our thinking on how and where we work. It's given us an opportunity to reimagine the workplace to best support organisations and people to be healthy and productive in a shared, sustainable environment. So the panel today will share their thoughts with you on what they think will be the future horizons for the specification and design of office buildings. There are actually 5 panel members. Our first panel member is Andrew Curran. Professor Andrew Curran is Chief Scientific Officer and Director of Research and at the Health and Safety Executive and a member of SAGE Committee, which has advised government during the pandemic. He can't be with us today in person, but kindly agreed to introduce the session with a recorded presentation where he'll share his thoughts with us, and we'll play that in a moment. Clare Danahay is one of the UK's leading interior designers and workplace consultants, the owner of Be Inspired Design. She's a member of the Regional Northern Committee and the National Technical Affairs Committee and brings a wealth of experience in the design of commercial office interiors to our panel today. Poole-Wilson is Lead Design Director at Will & Partners, leading design research practice in architecture, workplace, science and hospitality consultancy. He's really passionate about health and well-being through to sustainability and has researched these subjects for over 20 years and has produced many publications. Peter Stocks is partner in engineering consultants Cundall, where he heads the workplace sector consultancy. A long-standing member of the TAC, he specialises in low-energy design solutions for buildings and is a firm believer in keeping things simple in a complex world. Peter Williams, technical advisor to Stanhope. Peter's a leading member of the TAC and an editor of both the BCO Guide to Specification and the BCO Guide to Fit Out. All the key panel members, as Robin has said, have contributed to a series of briefing papers on COVID-19. And obviously, that's hopefully been helpful to the BCO community during these interesting and changing times. So on that, I think we'll play the introductory video. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Andrew Curran and I'm HSE's Chief Scientific Advisor and Director of Research. And it's a huge pleasure for me to be able to address you this morning. And a huge thank you to the organisers for inviting me to present at this important meeting. Very sorry I can't be there with you today, but I thought I'd give you a view from my perspective as a chief scientific advisor within government and from a participant at SAGE as to what we need to think about when reimagining our workspaces for the future, with a particular focus on what I think we've learned from the pandemic. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about what we can learn from some of the research that we've been doing, what that can tell us more broadly about key risk issues, how we can make sure that as a consequence of that learning, we can innovate at pace. A bit of a focus on how we need to make sure we're thinking about the systems approach as opposed to the component approach. And this then a few words of conclusion right at the end. So let's have a think, first of all, about what we can learn from research. And as I said right at the start, I'm going to talk about this in the context of the pandemic. And for those of us who've been very significantly involved in this work, it was quite interesting to compare the work that had been done over the last 100+ years on influenza. And if you do a search of the literature using some very simple terms, you can show that between 1917 and 2020, there were about 134,000 research publications on influenza. If you do the same for the virus that causes COVID, SARS-CoV-2, you can show that between 2006 and 2021, with the majority of those publications obviously coming after January 2020, there were 32,768 publications in that time frame. So there's a huge amount of information that we've gathered in that very short space of time that enable us to understand how we need to control the risks resulting from this horrible virus. When we then sort of look forward and think about what that can teach us about resilient environments for the future and how we might need to change the way that we think about office spaces, there's been some work done already, some very good work by the Royal Academy of Engineering and the National Engineering Policy Centre, which is available on their websites, which has drawn together experts and panels of individuals involved in this space to think about what needs to be done to ensure that those workspaces of the future are appropriately designed so that we can make them safe for everybody, learning from the pandemic and making sure that engineering sits at the heart of that. I would argue that we need to think perhaps a little broader than just engineering, and I'll hopefully pick up on some of those additional points as I go through my presentation this morning. So what can we understand about the key risk issues when it comes to thinking about keeping those workspaces of the future healthy and safe? Well, what we've been doing is running one of 7 national core studies on COVID. Ours is around transmission of the virus, and we've called it PROTECT. And what we've been thinking about in the context of that study is the risk factors that develop COVID within particular workspaces. And I think there are some really important lessons that we can learn from the work we've been doing to think about how workplaces and workspaces should be designed for the future. We have this model, which I think is really quite useful in thinking about this particular challenge. And it demonstrates really that you can't just think about any one thing. And for us, it was really important that we thought about the interaction between human behaviors, the characteristic of the key risk, in this case, the virus, and the environments in which those things were coming together, because all of those factors were important in understanding transmission. And of course, if you move away from COVID, the intersection between the risk, be it other than viruses, the behavior of people in the space and the environments themselves are really the key factors to consider when working out what you need to do to design workplaces that are healthy and safe for everyone. In the context of COVID, we've had to think about 3 routes of transmission: surface, air, and person to person, to minimize risk within that particular context. And the reason that we set up the PROTECT study was really to provide some real world understanding of what was going on as a way of informing policy and practice within our response to COVID. And the fact that we could be rapid and responsive meant that we could look at how innovation could be used to design solutions to some of these issues during the whole of the pandemic situation. And of course, what we really wanted to do ultimately was to leave a legacy impact so that organisations could think about how to manage risk to improve the work environment going forward. We have a number of themes which link together. We look at outbreaks, which is a really good and important way of understanding why things go wrong. We think about how we can model the transmission of the virus using the information that we collect. We've done some work in sector-specific areas, so that might be transport, it might be other areas. And we've also done some experimental infection models to really understand how the virus moves around a space. We then link all that together with some specific methods and tools and synthesize that knowledge to provide appropriate advice to policymakers and also practical tools to people who might be having to deal with these issues. And I think it's really important that we think about how all of these things join together to provide an evidence base to ensure that we can make appropriate decisions when it comes to protecting people in work environments. So a few thoughts about innovating at pace. And one of the things that we've seen very clearly during COVID is that people have had to do things differently and change the way that they organise themselves within a work environment. That includes office spaces as well as other workplaces. And this is just one example of a work environment where people were processing food. You can see that they had a very cramped production line where people were facing each other. What they were able to do by working together, bringing together the managers and the workers, they were able to redesign that line very quickly and make sure that there was sufficient space for people to be socially distanced and that nobody was standing or operating directly opposite another member of their team. So you can see how by working with the people involved in the activities, you can start to create solutions to some of the problems. And one of the lessons I think that's really important to learn from COVID is that people do need to be part of the solution. If the people using the space aren't involved in the conversations, then I think you can end up with solutions that might work on paper, but when it comes to practical implementation, might be quite difficult to actually get to work. Obviously, you can then think about a whole range of other work environments. And one of the things that we've really been able to demonstrate through the work we've been doing on our study is that you don't just think about the main work activity. You need to think about all the activities that comprise the work itself. And that goes for canteens, smoking shelters, evacuation procedures, restrooms, and office environments. And the same would go for any space moving forward. We're doing an investigation at the moment, which I can't say too much about, but it is in an office space where they haven't really thought about how different parts of the office space interact together. And we found very high levels of viral contamination in a security space, which is separated from the main office. But of course, those security guards are walking around the space and spreading the virus. So it's really critical that people understand how all the elements of a work environment work together to deliver that complete solution. And that brings me very nicely onto one of the key issues for me, which is not just thinking about components, but thinking at the systems level. You don't need to worry about the detail on this graph, but this is another example of an outbreak investigation where we looked at a motor vehicle manufacturer. And you can see from the different sizes and different heights of these red bars that not every part of that work environment was giving, say, the same levels of attack rates, that's the number of people who get the virus, because they were all set up differently, they were all doing different things. Obviously, people therefore need to think about each of those work activities and each of the issues that need to be considered when putting in place an appropriate solution. The key message, therefore, I think in the context of designing spaces for the future is that each one of the spaces in any given building has a role to play, and understanding what that role is and how it interfaces with all the other roles enables you to design a system that actually works for the people in the building, as opposed to one that works for perhaps a different master. Again, the detail of this isn't important, but there's a really important issue emerging from our COVID work around place. And by that, I mean that if you take, for instance, in this case, manufacturers of food and look at the different outbreak rates around the country, they're not all the same. And you see that different parts of the country have perhaps higher rates than other parts of the country. So where you live and where your workplace is located is another risk factor for some of the issues we've seen with COVID. And interestingly, we've been doing some work on what we call areas of enduring prevalence. And you can see the red areas in these three graphs here changing over time, but they have remained consistently high in the prevalence of COVID that they've seen. When we've looked into this in more detail, it's become clear that this pattern's been repeated for centuries. So it mirrors what happened with child poverty in the 19th century. It mirrors what happened with the flu epidemic in the early 20th century. And we're seeing the same thing in COVID now. So where you live, where your workplace or your office is located, can deliver different outcomes from a health perspective. And that, I think, is a really important point for us to consider when we're designing workplaces of the future. Because if we're not taking those other factors into account, we may be repeating a design, but actually delivering different health outcomes depending on where that design is actually situated. And then finally, one of the things clearly that the Royal Academy of Engineering report highlighted, and work that we'll be doing again with our national core study has highlighted, is that ventilation and the way that spaces are ventilated becomes really important. And we've done that with a mix of experimental work, and this is an output from a computational fluid dynamics model, which really just looks at what happens using the data available in different spaces. The stick person here in this top set of boxes has had a cough incident and her screen has been put in place. And you can see that immediately the screen helps to reduce some of the big particles, which are coloured red. But over time, and not very much time actually, the screen does a little bit for, again, those large particles. But at the end of 5 minutes, the particles are dispersed around the entire room. And therefore, ventilation becomes a really important tool to manage exposure in those particular workplaces. And again, if we're thinking about how we build resilient workplaces for the future, making sure that the ventilation really works, not just in the large open plan spaces, but also in the smaller office spaces, becomes really critical to ensure that that work environment is suitable to deliver a resistant environment for people. One final point to make on the systems point is that if you look at the entire system from build to demolition, you have to make sure that all parts of that system are working together. We've done a piece of work with the building and construction sector as part of our national core study. And this was one of the quotes from a building construction firm who told us that whilst COVID has changed the world, it didn't actually change the contract on the job. So they were having to work in an environment where they were still held to the original delivery requirements. They were still held to the initial build requirements of that contract, but to deliver that was very hard within the context of COVID. So making sure that the whole system works together to deliver these suitable spaces for the future is really critical. So just a few words then in conclusion. I think it's really important that when we're designing new spaces and designing new spaces to deal with a whole raft of potential issues, that we reflect and use the learning that we can gather from a wide range of experiences to make sure that we're making best use of that learning in consultation with those individuals who'll be using the space to make sure that it's appropriate for the task to which it is going to be used. Critical for me is this difference between a systems approach and a component approach. And I think that you have to understand how the people, the plant, the place, the processes interact together to deliver a working environment, to really get to grips with the design issues that you have around any space for work or indeed for leisure. And within any space, within any system, there will be interfaces. And it's the challenge of managing the issues at the interfaces that can lead, I think, to some other unintended consequences. So making sure that the design process considers how those interfaces will be managed will help to reduce issues such as mental ill health and to support diversity and inclusion. And again, it's only by working with those individuals who understand what those challenges might look like that will make those places suitable for the future world of work. I hope that's given some food for thought. It's been based on our experiences with COVID, but I think the general lessons are transferable across other areas. So I thank you for your attention, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of the day. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Certainly an insider's view, if you like, of what's been going on and some of the advice that's been given to government and some thoughts on what we need to think about. Providing infection-resilient environments, getting people involved in the conversation, considering the different activities that take place in the workplace. I think we're all familiar in the world of property with the location, but there was a different take on location, which the enduring areas of infection. The importance of good ventilation, we certainly must learn the lessons from the pandemic going forward and think about a systematic and integrated approach. People, plant, places, processes, and the interfaces with mental health, well-being, diversity, and inclusion. So I'm going to start with a question for Peter Stocks, picking up on that ventilation piece. BCO reviewed its guidance on ventilation and increased the recommended fresh air allowance. Do you think more post-pandemic research, when it's conducted, this will be need to sort of point in the direction of increasing this again? Will natural ventilation and mixed mode solutions become more popular? And how crucial will good ventilation be to rebuilding confidence and getting people back into the office?
Okay. First of all, interesting, the engineer goes before the architect. Just shows the importance of this issue to the to the world, effectively. BCO obviously have spent a lot of time looking at the scientific advice that we've had to date, and it extends from infection from surfaces as well as airborne particles. And I think as the research has gone on over the last 18 months, airborne particles have been the most significant factor in infection. So ventilation is the most important part that we have to deal with when we're designing buildings. Neil mentioned that our paper that we issued last year, it was about July last year, we increased to 14 litres per second from 12, which is still above the building regulations minimum, which has been the same for about 20 years. The government's put a white paper out at the moment on future building standards, which is quite interesting because they produced that in the pandemic. The consultation period, I think it finished about April, May, but I haven't heard anything since then because a lot of people responded to that. And there were two sort of major issues in there. One was the fact that all building ventilation systems should be monitored. And it actually gives you an example of that using CO2 measurement. And we might come on to that later in terms of Internet of Things and smart building systems. The other one was that ventilation rates should be able to be increased in times of pandemic by 1.5 to 1.7 times. And that's quite significant because that does mean that air handling units, risers, ducts, ceiling voids would have to get bigger to cope with that, to still satisfy all the other design criteria. And that does have an environmental, it deals with the environmental issue as well as an economic issue. So from our point of view, I think we've seen 18 months of working from home, hybrid working, and during that period, there's not been as many people in the office. So if you're still operating at those 14 litres per second, those management processes will operate to make sure that you don't get too many people in the office. People do get the right amount of ventilation and outdoor air. And I think the final thing on natural ventilation and mixed mode, it's a significant factor. Natural ventilation is a big weapon in our armory to get to net zero carbon. And I think a lot of buildings do not lend themselves to it easily because they're deep plan, you've got lots of cellular offices, so you have to have some natural ventilation. And I think throughout the year there are shoulder periods where you can use natural vent, mixed mode, open windows, examples such as the Pinell building reception, which has big sliding doors. We'll have to look at our design criteria from that point of view and what relaxations can be made. But at the end of the day, if we don't do those kind of things, we won't meet net zero carbon. And that does help as well in terms of dealing with COVID-19 and the pandemic and future pandemics, although they are only sort of once in a generation. So I think it's something we've got to do. We've got to look at. It's one of the first things we should do when we're designing a building is how can we get natural ventilation into there. But we also know that we have to ventilate during winter times and summer times and recover the heat from that because of the environmental cost.
Okay, thanks, Peter. So, Will, ventilation plays a key role in providing a healthy workplace, but there are many other factors that will influence how we use our offices and help attract people back to the workplace. What will be the collective experience that we've all been through over the last 18 months? What will that do to our thinking, and what will it mean for the reimagined office of the future?
Thank you, Neil. I think the key piece, and that we're working on that, is around the acceleration of a lot of thinking that existed before, particularly around human experience. And its underlying answer to that is that design matters. Within that, there are 7 different lenses we're focusing on. We're focusing on the journey to work and the journey within the office space, whether that also be workplace and workspace, but also engagement that Andrew referred to there, actually communicating to people, because what a lot of people don't understand, particularly your employees, is really what the evidence base actually is. It's reported in the press, that informs people, but actually it's very important that the occupier, but also the landlord, combine together to explain what that answer is, so that people can get the answers of the future that they really want. One of those is another of our lenses, which is health and well-being. Health is critical to getting people back to the office, helping them to understand what they're going to get, whether that's about ventilation or actually the spaces they're in, as Andrew referred to, in terms of how they move around the building. The fourth one is sustainability. It's incredibly important still. It's there. It is part of our health answer as we come back as well, but the two are different. The fifth one, is resilience. We need to design to make sure that these buildings work for a future, and it is a different future. It's terribly exciting. We're going to be able to design offices in a totally different way, which brings us on to technology and leadership, which are our final lenses. Leadership, I think, is a really interesting lens. We've experienced the last 18 months is a very different way for leaders to lead, but they all need to come back to the office. They realise that, but they've realised that technology has changed the way we work, and that leads us then to the other things like the hybrid working. What we're seeing in our first 3-4 months in hybrid working is actually people really prefer just to work on a Monday and a Friday. That's creating problems. We'll see what comes out, and we'll see more direction on that as we get towards January. The other thing is density. Really interesting data back on the density in the last 3-4 months, which is density is increasing, whether that's a response to pre-pandemic and the fact that absenteeism was rising, or whether it's a response to people's needs and that human experience versus evidence, we're not sure yet, but it's interesting. And then finally, utilisation and return to work rates. We're seeing return to work rates of 38 to 42% at the moment across the UK. Some places are higher than others. I heard this week that that's actually increased again. Still need to verify that as a piece of data. But that's against utilisation rates of, say, 60% or even 55% pre-pandemic. So you can see that there's a 2/3 return to work already in place, and we haven't got to January, where a lot of people are then putting back to their employees, it really is a return to work. So that I think is the picture we see at the moment emerging to design to the future.
Yeah, a good point as well, and I think made by Andrew, it's not just the office, it's the whole journey to and from and through the spaces and how those spaces are used. And I think as Will has said, we've seen people coming back to work now, and we're all looking forward to that. I think renewed optimism around the sector and office buildings. And I was wanted to ask Claire, what are you seeing in terms of new trends emerging? What are your clients asking for in their interior design? Andrew talked about the need to support mental as well as physical health and the importance of well-being, diversity and inclusion. And how do you design for those things?
Well, I think some of the things that we learned pre-pandemic around well-being and designing for inclusion haven't really changed. We knew that air quality was important. We knew that environmental quality was important. What I think COVID has really shone the light on is the fact that it's really identified. When we were all working from home, there was no escaping that you had a child in the background. I've certainly been on calls where she was singing or skipping whilst I was trying to have a sensible conversation with a client. It's humanised us all. It's reminded us all that we've all got a life outside of work. And what we need to do is continue that consideration of us as individuals when we look at how we design a workplace. Everybody's role is different and their reason for coming into the office is a different one. So therefore, we really need to understand what an organisation is doing and what those people within the organisation are actually doing as an activity. Andrew touched on it as well about the fact that managers need to connect with their people to be able to get the correct spaces. I'm sure anybody in the design industry has experienced a brief that's come from a client where it's the leaders telling us what we're doing and they haven't actually even spoken to the people that are on the shop floor, so to speak. We need spaces that actually are friction-free and easy for people to use, and that will encourage them to want to come back into the workplace. Wellbeing needs to consider mental health and how we build a culture around an office. And without an office, you don't get that culture and that supportive behaviour. But we need the right spaces to be able to do that. So I think it will be not considering as many desks. Let's not design our offices on how many desks we can fit in it. Let's reduce our densities and consider actually what spaces are going to really support people to do their jobs properly. And that will only come if leaders really buy into that approach and allow us all to talk to the people.
I hear that leadership thing coming through, and people have really got to, I think, demonstrate and lead by example in what we do going forward. So Peter, our response to the pandemic is not the only driver in office design. The climate emergency, the need to reduce energy use and create net zero carbon buildings and operation and construction is key to a sustainable future. So how do we maintain that balance between embodied and operational carbon for both new developments and for refurbished buildings?
Well, taking COVID as a once-in-a-generation type event, and I'm very much in line with Peter here that, by and large, we could deal with that through management processes rather than redesigning a building wholesale and incurring all the carbon costs that go with that. But I think in balancing our approach to developing new and old buildings is using whole-life carbon much more than we do at the moment, albeit that's a difficult thing to do. For many new developments, the balance is perhaps more than 50% in favour of embodied carbon, and as we drive down operational energy, then so it's going to become even more influential. I think at the moment the spotlight is on operational energy for a few reasons. One, because I guess it's easy to measure, and the other is that there are many regulatory hurdles it's got to get across. So if you're going to build a building, you have to report on its operational energy to comply with regulation. And also, we probably all work under the influence of many, I'll call them voluntary accreditations, but in truth, they're effectively turning into quasi-regulation as well, things that we have to meet. And that can generate some unwanted consequences. So in the drive to reducing operational energy, we introduce more cost, and it does count, introduce more cost and more complication perhaps into our systems. And in the process of getting past some of these regulatory hurdles, it's very easy for us to forget the effect of embodied carbon. And you see this, say, in a refurbished building where perhaps there are high aspirations about the operational energy, but to get past those hurdles, some of which we've set for ourselves, we may throw away great swathes of an existing building because it doesn't help us achieve those operational aims. So the benefit of using whole-life carbon in that context is to step back from over-focus of one part of it and see what is the best that we can do. And I think comes into this as well, that perhaps not identified in the way that we assess these things at the moment, is the timing of carbon emission as well. So embodied carbon is emitted now. When we build a building, embodied carbon has already existed, and same as controversially, if you buy an electric vehicle now, that you've had that carbon, that's gone, you can't do anything about that. And the operational energy is going to, if we're lucky, pay back for that sometime in the future. But if we really recognise that it's important to reduce emissions now and not just sometime in the future, then perhaps we ought to be looking at whole life carbon again and the all-important aspects of trying to minimise the amount of embodied carbon, reuse as much as we can rather than build from scratch. I'll just say as something as an aside, not a direct answer to your question, Neil, but I think, again, in a moment, currently with our focus on operational energy, and I'm a fan, don't get me wrong, I think we don't pay enough attention to the way that buildings are managed. So design and construction and the commissioning of these systems is all important, but that's only a snapshot in time. It's practical completion, perhaps just a couple of years following that. But in actual fact, the building's got its entire life to come after that, and the way it consumes energy and emits carbon is directly related by the way that occupiers behave and a way that building managers interact with those occupiers in the building. At the moment, I think building managers are underappreciated. Many of them are unsung heroes, and there's a huge amount that we can do to improve the performance of buildings without emitting any more embodied carbon by a smart system.
Great. We're on quite a tight timetable, but I think I've got about 10 minutes or so for questions. I think you're all familiar with the fact you can ask questions on Slido, and there is a roving mic, so don't be shy if there's something that you want to raise. While you're having a little think in the audience, I'll just perhaps pick up one or two from Slido. A question on the ventilation here from Clare Callan. Do the public at large understand ventilation? Are there any plans for government to require businesses to advertise the building standard of ventilation, like a food hygiene rating? Maybe that's one for you, Peter.
Yeah, I don't think people do understand ventilation properly, and one of the big issues is there is no measurement of it and no display of how the air quality operates within buildings. And particularly if you have a building, multi-tenanted building that's been fitted out a few times and dampers have been changed and moved, and you don't get the same levels of ventilation that it was originally designed for. I think I mentioned earlier that the current white paper that's out at the moment does mention carbon dioxide sensing, which is a proxy for fresh air. And if we can build those into our new buildings and fit them to old buildings, I don't know if that will be something that the government proposes. It doesn't usually go back into the past, but I think that can then be displayed like a display energy certificate in the building. People will have, and there's a lot of, in a lot of smart buildings now, there's apps where you can hook up to the building systems and you can actually see what the carbon dioxide measurements are in your area. We had it in our office and we set these IEQ sensors up, and we had it broadcast in our front reception area, what the different carbon dioxide levels were in different areas, and it's incredibly surprising how you do get over 1,000 parts per million quite quickly, usually after lunch when there's more people in. So I think it's, carbon measurement, smart buildings, carbon dioxide measurement, smart buildings, and displaying it. I think it would be a really good way forward for that.
Okay, I've got any hands in the audience just a minute. There's a couple of things here, perhaps for Will and Clare, both around the density and the utilisation of space. Zaid Al-Salim has asked if utilisation has reduced due to hybrid working, what is driving increased density? I think you mentioned an increased density point in your initial comments, Will. And then post-pandemic research, the BCO showed average workplaces were occupied about 55%. I think we're talking about utilisation. Are there any new metrics emerging, or do we intend to do a new study in this area? I think probably we do need to do a lot of research, actually, across a lot of subjects, the ventilation piece, utilisation of space, and really engaging the individuals and the customers that use the buildings, as was picked up by a number of the speakers. So I don't know if you're going to pick up on those utilisation density points.
Yeah, well, I think the point really is about the fact that pre-pandemic, we were getting to a point where occupancy densities were, you can spin it either way, very increased or low rate. So we were kind of looking at buildings which might be 6 square metres per person, which is drastically lower than what we as the BCO recommend at 9.6 square metres per person. What we're seeing now is that there's an increase to start raising that level. So the likelihood is that we might start to see more offices that are regularly occupied at 10 square metres per person, if not even going back to the more 12, 14 square metres per person that we used to see in the early 2000s. And I think it's actually that we're going to see as a change. What I wouldn't want to see, and I hope doesn't happen by any occupier, is that they start to think, oh, we haven't got all of our people in all the time. We can really start cramming the space together when we get back into the office. It will lead to two things. People are used to working in a nice, quiet environment at home. They're not going to want to go back into an environment where they're sitting with 150 people on the telephone around them, all trying to do Teams calls, which for some reason is far more distracting than people just having a chat. So we really need to think very carefully about how we're occupying our spaces. The most positive briefs that we've seen and projects that we've seen have been led by people and HR teams, not by finance directors. And I think if we've got a drive on finance to push our space down, then we're not going to end up with a great workplace.
Okay.
Neil, if I could just add to that.
Go on then.
I think the other point is we still don't quite know what's happening with hybrid working and whether that's just a Monday and a Friday thing, to Claire's point. And I think the other thing I'd pick up on is I think there's we've got to be careful about what we see in the utilisation figures, and then also how we communicate that to the people coming into the office. I think it sort of goes to Peter's app. I think it's good for people to see the numbers so that they understand exactly how the offices are being used.
Absolutely. I think there was a question here that I was going to ask Peter. Just give me a second to get this back on. Martin Smith has said the BCO M&E standards and design parameters in the guide don't really clarify what you need to do to get to net zero carbon and operation and construction. When do you think that will be looked at by the TAC? And is really looking for us to give smaller developers that perhaps don't have technical advisors within their own teams the opportunity to sort of take guidance, if you like, as where to go and how to try and tackle these challenges that we have.
Well, it's a good question, and it's timely as well, because there's a piece of work underway at the moment. The guide was published in 2019, and the sections that cut across net zero carbon were written really towards the back end of 2018, and lots of things have happened since then. So there's a paper in preparation at the moment, which will give further advice in the changes that happened in regulation and direction, and how to apply them as well. I think without giving huge amounts away, we still need to make sure that we provide workspace that works for tenants. But what we can see over and above that, particularly with the advent of things like neighbours, design for performance, is that there's perhaps a different way that we set about design the systems that provide those criteria. And that comes primarily through an approach to diversity. Not everybody's going to be in the building at the same time. I think that's a conclusion we've drawn, and that was already the case, but we've got more opportunities for extreme diversity to be applied. And also, by the time that's taken back towards central plant, there's a more intelligent, if you will, design that can be carried out. So instead of, for instance, simplistically 2 big chillers, maybe there are 6 small chillers, which means that we're better able to cope with variations in capacity and still maintain really good efficiency. So that's just a kind of brief foretaste of things, but it is on the horizon.
So on the theme of new material that's going to come through from the TAC, I think Will and Claire, you're both working on the framework for the new BCO guide to fit out, which is planned to be released later next year. Can you give us your thoughts on how it will be influenced by the human experience of the pandemic, the importance of leadership, which I think you both touched on in office design thinking, and how we may use space differently?
So I think but that probably goes back to the point I made earlier about leaders have learned a lot through the pandemic about the use of technology and how technology works in the office. And that really is the driver for hybrid working. So really successful leaders probably have to be back in the office, and I think we're seeing that already. We're certainly seeing C-suites, perhaps the tier below, returning to the office, and then actually the younger generations following up because they want to see those leaders. That leadership point, though, means to different ways to design. So what they've learnt is they've learnt perhaps what I call the different verticals of how they work within their business. So we need to listen and understand that. So they work on perhaps what we used to call project team bases. I think that's still a factor on how you could work with it. But it means that spaces just are different, or the spaces that they want to work in are different, whether that is localized offices, more open plan, places for quiet areas. There is a whole myriad of differences appearing which we can design to, which is really fascinating and interesting. Of course, that needs to be watched in terms of sustainability. We're not suggesting that we should redesign absolutely everything and throw stuff away. So there is a reuse question as well.
I think it's also really important to think about the way people teams, HR teams are actually leading projects now, rather than it being, and that feeds into the fact that there's been a change in direction about what's leading a project and how leadership are engaging with that. And they're recognising that it is much more about the human experience and the human journey within the office, rather than it being purely a property realm or it being purely financially led. And that change towards culture means that we need to think about who we're engaging with as a project team in a different way to perhaps we were 10 years ago when we were looking at projects.
Okay. I've got a little technical one for you, Peter. With large quantities of people returning to work, this is from Duncan Adams, what key remedials are needed to existing ventilation systems in the buildings they are returning to?
Well, I think the first one, there's two issues here. One is for relatively new buildings that are well managed. It's not too difficult. I think there's a massive amount of our building stock that has had air conditioning, little VRF units installed, but not had any proper ventilation put in. So I think that those that are going back to older offices really need to go to their facilities managers and just find out, what kind of ventilation system they've got, if they've got one. Loads of them will be relying purely on infiltration through the facade rather than proper ventilation. And that's, I think, something that, it's the elephant in the room. We deal with about 3 or 4% of new buildings every year, and they're nice and shiny and well commissioned, and we're starting to do the DFP neighbours. But a lot of the older buildings, people just go into them. And I think the advent of smart technology, what I was talking about earlier in terms of carbon dioxide measurement, which again is a proxy for fresh air or outdoor air, as more and more people take it up, it becomes cheaper, and the equipment for it becomes cheaper. So it's going to be difficult to do over the next sort of year and a half, but it is coming in. We're doing a massive amount of work with a lot of people like Google on smart technology and smart buildings now all over the world. So I think, in terms of sensing the ventilation systems in their own buildings, it's incredibly difficult because unless you know about it, and this is what we were talking about earlier, it's very difficult to understand that it's an issue with the ventilation system.
Yeah, some more work for those operations people, Peter.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm coming close to the end now. Is there any questions from the audience? I've got a few more on Slido, and I've got another question that I can keep going, but if there's a question.
Eddie Jumps, London Tom Setti. With the government announcing this week that by 2035 that we'll have 100% renewable electricity, then presumably the balance of what we need to look at in buildings will shift quite rapidly. And I wondered what the Pennell thoughts were.
If it's all renewable energy, then there's no operational carbon emissions, so it all becomes about embodied carbon. I wish I believed them that 2035 was all renewable, but I think everyone should have a unicorn and a rainbow. But there's such a massive piece of infrastructure to get anywhere near that. That I think it's very unlikely. It's a destination I'd like to visit, but there's a long journey to get there. In the meantime, I think it just does really push this point that we've just talked about, really, is that the embodied carbon becomes all important at that point, because that's the only thing we have a lever to pull on. And that might drive our view of refurbishment particularly, and I suspect it would certainly change our view of complication in materials that we use in new construction.
I think there's probably another good reason for people going back to the office to work as well, because the office sector has made some great strides in reducing energy use. It's still got a long way to go. But obviously at home, if we're all working from home, most homes are heated by gas. We're trying to move away from fossil fuel. We could actually be using more energy at home than we would be in a really efficiently designed, healthy and infection-resilient environment at work, where you can interact with people, and the ideas that come from that can lead to good, productive work and obviously create value for us going forward. So I was just thinking on that energy point, perhaps to the two Peters, you know, that these new working patterns will have some impact on energy performance and the way buildings need to be controlled. Some new challenges, some unexpected consequences. I touched on one there with the move away from fossil fuel that I think will be accelerated in commercial buildings. And I think a number of people in their questions, and I sense from the audience, well, they sense this conflict between the need to reduce energy and carbon emissions, but at the same time provide safe, healthy workplaces. So how are we going to do that?
I think the easiest way to do that is using demand-led control. We talked about CO2 ventilation, switching sensors to switch equipment off when it's not being used. You know, fan coil units in meeting room meeting rooms keep churning away, whether there's anybody there or not. So I think that's one of the biggest. If you can switch it off, switch it off. That's my view.
I think we've seen some of this before. Say, for instance, managed space. If you book a room before you go into the office, and you can recognise as a building manager that perhaps only 2 floors are going to be used, you activate 2 floors and shut the rest down. Because whilst we might have falling energy consumption per square metre of office, if the office is not very heavily used, the amount of consumption per person may skyrocket. So in amongst this, you know, we're responding to things that we can measure. I mentioned earlier on that energy consumption is a very easy thing to measure from a meter, but figuring out where that energy is best spent, whether it's in someone's home or in another office, is quite a complicated thing to do. But I suspect we need some different metrics there to fully understand how the office is being used.
I think as well, Peter mentioned earlier about having 6 chillers instead of one big one, and then being able to, you can't turn chillers and air handling units down efficiently. They don't operate efficiently at very low levels, so having different sized units is a good option to enable you to get better control and better efficiency, although it may take more space because you've got more units to fit up there and more access space to allow for. So there's a number of issues that you know, you can actually move forward on.
I'm sure we're going to see some new technologies coming through, but also greater use of an older technology, heat pumps, which I think is going to be used to provide you know, very efficient heating in buildings as well as cooling. So we'll start to get more utilisation from less equipment. So it's all about getting more from less as we go forward and try and create that sustainable future, while at the same time creating buildings that really work for people. I think we're going to have to start to wrap up at this point. I'll be getting people waving in the background quite soon, I think. I sense that coming. So I've just got a concluding question for the members of the panel, just to sort of give us their benefit of their thoughts and prediction for the future of office design specification. Is there one thing that you'd like the audience to take away with them from what we've talked about today and what we've heard from Andrew? So should we start again at this end, Peter?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I mentioned a minute ago about the fact that there's a massive amount of existing building stock, and we need to get that up to the same levels and standards of new buildings. And I think when they come around for refurbishment, it's so easy for them to rip everything out and start again, but the whole issue of circularity and embodied carbon is so massive that we've got to look at how we can reuse some of these, the equipment that's in it. Obviously, it's not easy. It's a bit like, you know, fan coil units have motors and actuators and they wear out. But the main body of parts of equipment, we must be able to reuse.
Designed for longevity.
Yep.
I think it's the focus on human experience, that human engagement. To Peter's point, that could just as well be the engaging with your people within the office about how much energy they use at home and how much the office uses, and where do you think where do you want to be with that? Improving that level of communication that perhaps we here don't have, working to that leadership to do that communication, I think is key. So engagement with public is just as important as engagement with the office.
So it's about getting people into the conversation.
Absolutely.
I think it was Churchill who said, you know, we shape our buildings and then afterwards they shape us. Claire?
I think it's important that we don't we continue hybrid working. I think it's a really great way of working for people. It gives people lots of positive benefits about being able to be away from the office as well as being in the office. But being able to design a space where when they do come in, they've actually got choice about what their activities they're doing when they're in there, whether it's private Teams calls or whether they're in a collaborative space. I think you just need a range of positive settings which, again, engages with people, talk to the people, and provide them with the right spaces to do their job efficiently and productively.
Great spaces, great places. Peter?
Opposite sides of the same coin. I think building management is all important. Most of what we do is about providing potential. We chuck the keys over the fence at the end of some contract, then it's up to the building managers and the occupiers to get the best out of the building. So a plea to really pay attention to building management. The other side of that coin is collecting the data, bring back the evidence. One of the difficulties that we have as in the BCO is collecting good evidence upon which we can make decisions. So anything you can do to improve the data collection evidence from the buildings that you design and subsequently see the operation of is worth its weight in the precious metal of your choice.
Help the operations manager, I think, key point there. So I'd like to thank Andrew for his video contribution, the panel for an exciting and stimulating discussion, and the audience for your excellent questions. I'd like to finish with a plea. We are working on a new BCO guide to fit out, and the time could not be more opportune or its content more important. The panel's given their predictions on what the future horizons will look like, but are they correct? If you're involved in research or have anything that you can share with us to evidence the predicted structural changes in our sector, please share it with us. We'd welcome your feedback, thoughts and ideas. So thank you for being a great audience, and I hope you enjoyed the talk today. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you to your panel, Clare, Andrew, the two Peters and William, for a fascinating insight as to how the future office will evolve. There's plenty for people to think about regarding taking the office and its design forward. Thank you so much. Really interesting. We're now breaking for lunch, and I'd ask everyone here and all those attending virtually to be either back here in your seats or tuned in at 13:50, and we'll see you all then. Thank you.